Everything in moderation. I'm sure you guys have heard this phrase before. And in this video, I want to talk to you guys about a way, a tool, a method that you can use to get more value out of courses, out of frameworks, out of books, out of audiobooks, out of all these things you consume. This one framework shift will help you get a little bit more out of them. So I'll jump right in. So this video really should be called Everything on a Spectrum, because that's kind of the moral of the story. It's the same principle as everything in moderation, right? Which, like for me, still triggers back like using too much salt or using too much sugar in something when I'm cooking. But anyway, the first example jumping in is I love how Myron Golden will talk a lot about you can't have, like, nothing has only one side, right? Like a piece of paper, a coin. And he'll talk about love versus hate, right? He'll talk about how it's impossible to have love without some hate. There is no contrast if there's only light. There needs to be dark. And so it's the same with tolerance versus intolerant. If you tolerate everything, then you tolerate nothing. It's like there needs to be some level of contrast between the two. So a good first example that's actually practical to entrepreneurs and business people and people that are working on their career is mental flexibility. And I love the concept of mental flexibility. It's really key in terms of lowering your resistance, letting new things in, adaptability. I'm going through the book Think Again right now from Adam Grant, which is a great book, although I feel like the overall message of it could have been summed up in probably a paragraph or two. But Think Again, the whole premise of the book is really having this mental flexibility, psychological flexibility, being able to change your mind. And again, this is on a spectrum. You don't want to be constantly changing your mind and always moving from project to project to project, right? Like we all know someone like that has 500 projects, but none of them are completed. But to the same extent, you don't want to commit to things and then never change your mind. And so there is a spectrum on which it makes sense to be mentally flexible. You don't want to be at either pole. And that is like the theme of this whole talk. And I just want to point out a couple examples. That way you can grab them, hold on to them, and then apply them to your life. So another one, this was the concept that instigated actually doing this particular video, which was on imposter syndrome. So in the book, Think Again, Adam Grant goes into talking about imposter syndrome, and I forget the context in which it comes up, but they start talking about how there are a certain subset of people that there's this research study that's studying, and they have arrogant people and they have people with imposter syndrome. And these people with imposter syndrome are actually higher performing. And what I realized, I was listening to this at the gym, I realized like so many of the things that we think are bad or good, they're actually not one or the other. They should exist in your life on a spectrum. And so these people with imposter syndrome, the presupposition is that they're higher performing because they have some level of grit. They feel like they have something to prove, and therefore they keep themselves in check. Their performance is good. It's stable, but it's not. They're looking for more information, looking to improve. Another study that I had seen was it looked at surgeons that were like, maybe 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and 30 years. And they found that the surgeons that were 30 years in practice, they weren't actually better, because what happened was they would go on autopilot. And so that kind of moves towards the arrogant side of the spectrum, where it's like they're not thinking as critically about things. It's not as new. And, for you or I, if I'm going in for surgery, you're going to want the person with more experience, right? But it turns out that there's a happy balance in between. And so in the example of imposter syndrome or arrogance, it's on a spectrum. And I would define, to be clear, I would define imposter syndrome as competence without confidence. And then I would define arrogance as confidence without competence. So again, on a spectrum, right? Somewhere between those two is probably the ideal place to be. One I talked about a lot at length, and it's especially powerful, I think, for startups, is best practices, right? Like I know so many companies that have lived and subsequently died by following best practices as if they were blazing a new trail. But the thing with best practices is that they are the opposite of blazing a new trail. They take you to a trailhead that you then need to blaze yourself. And so you can follow them to a point, but you still need to make your own way. You still need to come up with your own ideas and your own concepts. So best practices on a spectrum. Self-comparison, this is one that everyone talks about as being so bad. It's so bad, self-comparison so bad, comparing yourself, it's this robs of all joy, blah, 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 blah. I don't see it that way. I think just like time, which I'll get to in a second, self-comparison is a tool. When you look at somebody else, a lot of times when I look at Alex Hormozy or different people that I look up to or aspire to be like, number one, I don't see them as competition, because you don't have any competition. There's no one that lived through the same experiences that you lived through at the same time, that saw the same things, that did the same stuff, that ate the same food, that believed the same beliefs. There's no one like you. And so there is a group of people that you have been uniquely put here to serve, and that's like a whole nother conversation. But self-comparison is a tool. You can see what other people did that may be similar to you and figure out how you want to do it differently. I have a whole video on this. You can go watch it. But self-comparison can also be a tool, like any tool, that if you wield it incorrectly can hurt you. And so if you're looking at it to say all of the things that I don't have, or all of the things that I lack, or they're so much farther ahead than me, right? So if you put on the lack cap, then you can go down a pathway where self-comparison is dangerous. If you're using it in a motivating way to say, you know, looking at Gary Vee or Alex Hormozy or some of these people, like, when you look at them and you really get to know them and research their lives, I don't think they would be offended if I was sitting across from them and saying that they're not all that different from you. They're not that much smarter than you. They just have some pieces of the puzzle figured out that you may not have. And so self-comparison can be a very powerful tool, especially when you evaluate some of the people that have made it. Using time as a tool, right? So I've talked a lot about Dr. Benjamin Hardy, Be Your Future Self Now, and a lot of his books that have to deal with time as it relates to psychology and where we view ourselves. So historically, Newtonian time has been like the past, it's dominoes, right? The past hits the present hits the future, and there's nothing you can do about your past, and you almost have no control. But really what's coming out in the newest level of psychology, and specifically positive psychology, is that the present defines the past. Like, the meaning of the past is defined in the present. But anyway, the point that I wanted to get to is that using the past as a tool can be really powerful. You can look back and see all of the things that you've accomplished, how far you've come from 6 months ago, from a year ago, from 10 years ago, all the things, trials and tribulations and things that you got through that you never thought you could handle, or accomplishments that you've made that you're way above where your 5-year goal was. Now, that won't be the case for every single thing. I'm sure you'll have some things where you come up short, but you'll be overwhelmed at how many positive things you've accomplished. You could also use it to go back and be like, oh, my parents said this, my brother said that, I'll never be good enough, blah, blah, blah. And so you can use time, you can wield it incorrectly as a tool to harm yourself. It's on a spectrum. Another one that's really powerful is knowing, or thinking really, but knowing versus doing. So there's one of my most famous quotes on Twitter is that to do has more wisdom than to know. Because there's a lot of people that know a lot of stuff and don't do a lot with it. And so there's a spectrum. You need to know certain things, or you should know certain things, but there's only certain things you can learn by doing. And so, again, on a spectrum. Clean eating, I was like, this blew my mind the other day. I was talking to my trainer. I'm at the gym, and he's like, the guy's a professional bodybuilder, and he's huge, and he's won a ton of awards. And we were talking about food and whatever, and he's like, it's important to not eat super clean every single day all the time, because your body goes into some level of homeostasis. And so now it's not expecting some of these carbohydrates or some of these, it's expecting a very consistent, it goes into this homeostasis, it's expecting very consistent whole foods, this perfect diet. He's like, every now and then, throw in a potato chip, have a potato, do something wild, to me that was freaking me out, because I'm I'd never get ice cream, I never do any of this stuff. And so I'm but it makes sense, because hormetic stress, your body needs hormetic stress in order to grow, right? And just kind of our immune systems, it's if we never had something for it to adapt to, there'd be no reason for it to adapt. And so every now and then, having something on a spectrum, having your diet on a spectrum can be helpful. And again, I know I recently did a video interviewing one of my good friends, Amun, who is on the vegan plant side of things, but I personally believe there's enough evidence biologically and from a hunter-gatherer perspective to suggest that carnivore's not right and totally vegan's not right. We have canines, we have enzymes in our gut specifically made to break down fish protein and animal proteins. So for me, there's enough natural evidence to say that we should be eating some mix of both. So again, on a spectrum. And then the last one is, this is the most important one, and this is the reason I made this, is when you look at other people's frameworks, their courses, their books, their videos, I think we can get into this trap of looking at everything as truth, and that is not on a spectrum. It's taking something for gospel. And I would do this too. I think like reading a lot of Dr. Ben's books, I would look at everything in there and be like, this is total fact. But the beauty of it is, because we're humans and we're not AI, we're always adapting, we're always changing. And it's not that there's not truth in those books. It's just that nuggets of truth sometimes change or they adapt in a different way. If they didn't, there would be no reason for Ben to write a new book. All the other books would just be the same forever into perpetuity, and he would never need to write anything new, because he kind of writes about the same topics in very different ways, because he's always discovering new information. So taking other people's frameworks, their books, their courses, looking at them, everything as its theory. Everything is theory. And then constantly leaving yourself in a place where you're open to evaluate and adapt new ideas as they come in. So even when you're learning, putting that on a spectrum, I think that's probably the most powerful one. I hope this video helped, and I'll see you in the next one.